Well, hello everyone. We are now 2:15, so I think we can start panel two. And so panel two will be on China's current foreign policy tactics, and we will have Dr. David Welch from the University of Waterloo and Dr. Lynette from the University of Toronto speaking. I will let Dr. David Welch have the stage with his presentation, China's current foreign policy tactics, East China Sea, South China Sea, and Taiwan. David Welch is the University Research Chair and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. He teaches at the Balsillie School of International Affairs and is co-editor with Tony Erskine and Stefano Guzzini of International Theory. His 2005 book, Painful Choices, A Theory of Foreign Policy Change, is the inaugural winner of the International Studies Association, ISSS, Book Award for the best book published in 2005 or 2006. And his 1993 book, Justice and the Genesis of War, is the winner of the 1994 Edgar S. Furness Award for an outstanding contribution to national security studies. Dr. David Welch, I will let you have the floor.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation to participate. I want to start by emphasizing what this panel is about. It's about China's foreign policy tactics, and it's important to distinguish strategy from tactics. So when states attempt to accomplish something, when anybody attempts to accomplish anything, they usually have the strategy in mind, which is an overarching vision of how they are to attain their goals. And they employ tactics, and tactics are local, tailored, on the ground kind of responses to situations intended to promote the goals of a fundamental underlying strategy. So if you have a country that has a coherent foreign policy, you'll be able to have a sense of its overall strategy, grand picture as it were. But you may see quite interestingly different tactics depending on the context and the situation that they're trying to manage. And this is indeed what we do see in some of the big flashpoints in East Asia. And I want to concentrate on three. I think they're three of the most important. Now, there's another one, of course, which is the Korean Peninsula. I don't have time to get into that, and China is not a frontline player in that one in any case, but it is a frontline player in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, and Taiwan. These are all plausibly three areas where a major war could break out between China and its neighbors, or between China and the United States. In fact, I would go so far as to say that Taiwan is the single most dangerous flashpoint in the world. If World War III doesn't break out as a result of Russia's current adventurism in Ukraine, it might well break out in Taiwan. So we should be especially worried about that. And I'll explain why. So let me start with tactics, and then at the end, I'll say a few words about what I think they say collectively about Chinese strategy. Next slide, please. I'll start with the East China Sea, which is, next slide again, just the maritime area to the east of China, south and southwest of Japan, north of Taiwan. And here China is involved in an important series of disputes with Japan primarily. And there are two kinds of disputes. There are maritime disputes, which is to say that China and Japan disagree on the appropriate delimitation of their maritime jurisdiction. And there's also a sovereignty dispute. And the sovereignty dispute concerns the Senkaku Islands, which are very small rocky outcroppings, quite close to Taiwan, in fact. Taiwan claims them as well, interestingly. So you've actually really got three countries, since Taiwan's a de facto country, vying for title to legitimate sovereignty over the Senkaku Islands. But they've been occupied by Japan since 1895, and been when the United States handed back sovereignty to Japan of islands it had occupied at the end of World War II, it handed back operational control of the Senkaku Islands to Japan as well. So basically they're under Japanese administration, but they're currently uninhabited. Now, I am fascinated by why countries have fierce rivalries over useless islands, and in this case over useless rocks. And I really would go so far as to say that these are utterly useless rocks, but they're pregnant with symbolic significance. The maritime dispute between China and Japan is actually under fairly good regulation. There's technically a bit of a dispute over who should be entitled to drill for natural gas at the far eastern edge of the continental shelf. quite far north from the Senkaku Islands. In fact, China is the only country that's got gas drills up there, and it's because it's physically impossible to ship gas from that area to Japan because of the intervening deep oceanic trench. So that's really a non-issue. The important issue is the dispute over the Senkaku Islands, and this came to a head in 2012 when arch-nationalist Shintaro Ishihara in Japan, who was a fierce critic of Japan's kid gloves approach to China, thought that the central government was being too pussyfooted about its treatment of Japanese rights and proposed to buy the Senkaku Islands from their private owners. And everyone knew that if he did that successfully, he would immediately start building structures and putting people in place there permanently, which to the Chinese, who are longstanding claimants, would be a red flag in front of the bull, right? And they would feel compelled to respond to it. So this proposed offer to buy the islands triggered a counteroffer from the Japanese central government to buy the islands from the private owners, and so the islands were nationalized. China saw this as an outrageous escalation in a long-standing territorial dispute. In fact, Japan designed this to try to prevent a crisis with China, but it triggered one. And so the response that China mounted, in addition to well, violent demonstrations in the streets of Chinese cities and burning and looting Japanese businesses and people burning Japanese cars and so on, outrage over Japan's nationalization of so-called Chinese territory. The government's main response has been to step up and maintain kind of a demonstration of non-recognition of Japanese sovereignty in the form of sailing ships into the maritime contiguous zone and territorial sea around the Senkaku Islands and flying aircraft within the airspace of the Senkaku Islands. Next slide, please. This chart shows you just how many times the Japanese have had to scramble fighter planes to meet Chinese aerial incursions over the Senkaku Islands. Next slide. This one shows you how many times Chinese boats have ventured into the contiguous zone and the territorial sea around the Senkaku Islands. And you can see that 2012 is a tipping point, a liminal point. But you'll also see, and this is quite interesting, fairly steady Chinese activity. In other words, once they escalated, they didn't really continue to escalate, and they didn't de-escalate. It's sort of some up and down from month to month. But for the most part, this is what China has been doing. It's just been kind of constantly signaling that it doesn't recognize Japanese sovereignty over the Senkaku Islands by challenging maritime and airspace sovereignty. Next slide, please. The other thing China did in 2013 was declare the establishment of an air defense identification zone in the East China Sea, which you see here outlined in red. This caused an international crisis as the world reacted in fear and horror at China attempting to assert its jurisdiction over the East China Sea with an air defense identification zone. This furor demonstrated that nobody knows what an air defense identification zone is. It's got no jurisdictional implication whatsoever. Any country, anytime, can declare an air defense identification zone wherever they want. Doesn't give them any legal rights. It's just a convenience for them to try to reduce the number of times they have to scramble aircraft to identify unidentified intruders. So the Chinese government didn't actually realize this. And the backstory is fascinating. It was a PLA initiative to attempt to assert jurisdiction. The foreign ministry was cut out of this decision. People in the foreign ministry were aware that this was actually just a bad move and had tried to oppose it, but they didn't have the opportunity. So that was 2013. Interestingly, China doesn't really operate this air defense identification zone at the moment. They don't have the capacity, and they've just kind of let it go. So that's what's been happening in the East China Sea. Tactically, just a kind of a steady drumbeat of signaling that doesn't run any major risk of confrontation with Japan. As long as Japan doesn't escalate by, for example, putting troops or missile batteries or installations on the Senkaku Islands, I think we can expect this to be the norm going forward. Okay, next slide. Let's talk about the South China Sea, which gets a lot more attention these days, probably rightly because it's more complicated. It's also more interesting. Next slide, please. Here's a map of the South China Sea, and what you see here in yellow are all of the features, the territorial features that are disputed in the South China Sea. These are the things that countries can't agree on which country has sovereignty over. China claims them all. So does Taiwan. Vietnam claims a bunch, the Philippines claim a bunch, Malaysia claims a bunch. So there's multiple overlapping claims in some cases. Three important rough groups of features here in the northwest here. You see the Paracel Islands. Those are occupied by China, claimed by Vietnam. The Spratly Islands, it's the lower collection, by far the largest number. Again, entirely claimed by China and Taiwan. Taiwan only actually physically controls one. They control the best one, but they only have one. China only controls 7, and China's 7 are actually not very good quality features. And then Malaysia and the Philippines control quite a few. This is where most of the press activity has been. And then Scarborough Shoal in the upper right, standing there on its lonesome, is contested by Philippines and China. Next slide, please. If you're interested in a detailed understanding of who actually controls what in the South China Sea, you can find it here. And so it's the Spratly Islands are kind of like an alphabet soup of different countries occupying different features. Next slide, please. Now, one thing you will encounter if you read about the South China Sea anywhere is this stock phrase that China claims virtually all of the South China Sea. You'll see this everywhere. This is actually technically not true. All China has clearly claimed is territorial sovereignty over all of the rocks and islands, and they also claim it over shoals and so on. They have for many years, however, ambiguously kind of led people to believe that they also claim maritime jurisdiction over the South China Sea. And this is what the neighboring countries fear and what they object to most. Next slide, please. And to try to, bolster their position in the Spratly Islands and assert their presence, the Chinese engaged in a very aggressive artificial island building campaign, transforming their 7 low-grade features in the Spratly Islands into pretty formidable military outposts, 3 of which have the full runways, capable of handling military aircraft. China's activities in the South China Sea prompted the government of the Philippines in 2012 to file a suit in The Hague under provisions of the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, effectively to try to undermine any possible Chinese claim to extensive jurisdiction. Next slide, please. This is the courtroom. And you'll see on the left the Philippines legal team, and you'll see on the right the Chinese legal team, which isn't there, because China refused to participate, refused to acknowledge that the tribunal had any authority, claimed that it was all subterfuge on the part of the Philippines. So they didn't participate. But they did, however, make a terrible mistake, which was to write in too much detail why they weren't participating. And that gave the tribunal ample material to work with to actually recreate a good faith Chinese account of the defense they would have mounted if they were there. Next slide, please. Most of the arguments had to do with a lot of arcane interpretation of the provisions of the law of the sea. In other words, what maritime entitlements attached to what features. It's terribly complicated. The most interesting outcome of the tribunal ruling was that there are no islands, technical legal islands in the South China Sea, at least not in the Spratlys and not in Scarborough Shoal. They're all either rocks or low tide elevations. And under the UN Convention, none of those gets an exclusive economic zone. At most, they get a territorial sea, which is only 12 nautical miles instead of 200. So this had the effect of effectively undermining any possible extensive Chinese claim to maritime jurisdiction in the South China Sea. Even if they did have rightful sovereignty over all of the Spratly Islands, their jurisdiction would extend only 12 nautical miles around each of them. So most of the South China Sea would still be international waters or fall under the exclusive economic zones of literal states, Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, so on. So China in fact, has no right to an exclusive economic zone anywhere near the Spratleys Islands. This was hugely embarrassing to China. And the interesting, from my perspective, one of the most interesting outcomes of this process was that all of a sudden, China started to behave. Now, the rest of the world hasn't really noticed this. Next slide, please. You still have this dominant narrative that China is being expansionistic and aggressive, and it's an outlaw state. And the United States, in response, has stepped up freedom of navigation operations by sailing ships very close to features controlled by China, not just China, but mostly China. And this chart shows you how many freedom of navigation operations the Americans have sailed since they began under President Obama. But next slide, please. As I said, China's really been keeping its nose clean. If you look really carefully, they have stopped doing things that are technically inconsistent with the Philippines Arbitration Tribunal ruling. They've just stopped talking about the 9-dash line, which everyone thought was a basis of a legal claim. The tribunal ruled it had no legal status. They've stopped trying to enforce their own jurisdiction more than 12 nautical miles from features that they claim. There's a whole range of things they've just stopped doing. The idea here is they know they lost. They know that their claims are actually not sustainable, and that the UN convention that they've signed and ratified doesn't justify the extensive claims that the Chinese people think China has a right to. But the Chinese people still think that China has extensive maritime rights in the South China Sea, and the regime is desperate not to look like it's lost at the tribunal, or that it doesn't have the rights that everyone in China thinks they have. So they're walking this tightrope. And it's a complex story with an interesting explanation. If you're interested, in the chat, I'm going to put a link to a recent article I published with my colleague Mark Raymond that goes into gory detail, explaining exactly what's going on and why. But people generally haven't noticed that China is actually a much better citizen in the South China Sea now than they were before. Next slide, please. Part they don't notice, because China is still kind of aggressively trying to prevent other countries from doing things that would make it obvious that China lost. And so you get a lot of signaling, and you get a lot of, well, I don't know if it's a lot. You probably also get some back channel sort of threats that China might react badly if other countries did things that were within their sovereign rights, like drilling for oil in their own exclusive economic zones, that would make it obvious to the Chinese people that China doesn't have jurisdiction over those areas. So it's a incredibly delicate balancing act that's going on at the moment in the South China Sea. So again, technically very interesting, quite different in some interesting ways from what they've been doing in the East China Sea, which is a very straightforward policy of just sending a signal and maintaining it. Okay, next slide, please. Taiwan. We've already heard a lot about Taiwan. We've heard a lot about Taiwan that's very good, and I don't want to repeat any of that. Next slide, please. Just the reminder as to where Taiwan is. A relatively small island, relatively close to mainland China, but far enough away that it would be really a very big technical challenge for the Chinese to invade it. It would be a much more challenging amphibious operation than even D-Day in World War II. And there's a lot of hand-wringing about the United States' inability to help defend Taiwan against Chinese invasion. My own read is that the Taiwanese can probably do very well all by themselves, in part because there are no beaches. The Chinese don't have any amphibious landing craft, at least not enough to land on the beaches if they were there. Chinese would be almost entirely dependent upon using existing port infrastructure to unload invading troops. That's not going to happen. So, we're a decade away from China actually being able to mount a credible military threat against Taiwan. And the Ukraine war, I think, is making the Chinese think even further about the viability of a military solution to that particular problem. Next slide, please. But I agree with Tom Christensen that Tsai Ing-wen has actually been doing a great job of making sure that Taiwan doesn't cross any particular red line that would effectively force China to act on Taiwan. But the long-term problem remains. Next slide, please. And the long-term problem is that the Taiwanese decreasingly identify as Chinese. Next slide, please. These are opinion polls taken of Taiwan, asking Taiwanese people, how do you identify? Do you identify as Taiwanese only? Do you identify as Chinese only? Or do you identify as both? There's a very strong, clear trend. Over time, Taiwanese are going to stop identifying as Chinese or even as both Taiwanese and Chinese and just identify as Taiwanese. And so Taiwan has lost any interest in actually making good on its traditional claim that the rightful government of all of China is in Taipei at the moment. And it's almost inevitable, I think, at some point that the Taiwanese will just say, we're not interested in ruling the mainland anymore. So we're two separate countries. Now, part of Tsai Ing-wen's genius is that she's able to thread the needle here by avoiding any sort of unilateral declaration of independence that might trigger a Chinese strike of some sort, but also by insisting that Taiwan is already an independent country. And this is right there on the presidential website. So there's no secret that she thinks, and the majority of Taiwanese legislators think, that Taiwan is already a separate country, that there really are two Chinas. And Taiwan does a pretty good job of navigating, the complexities of world politics to assert itself as an independent polity. And it's increasingly getting support from other countries as well. China doesn't like this. China doesn't react well when the United States does things or American officials say things that make it sound like they're tending to support Taiwanese independence increasingly over time. Next slide, please. And again, the main Chinese response we have seen has been military signaling. So China has been flying aircraft in formation, in varying numbers, varying kinds of aircraft and so forth, close to Taiwan. But interestingly, never into Taiwan's territorial airspace. They've only been flying missions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, which, as I noted earlier, doesn't confer any jurisdiction of any kind. So it's actually a fairly timid signal. It's kind of, we're here, we don't like what you're doing. Pay attention to us and our needs and concerns. And next slide, please. There's a plausible argument to make that the real intended audience for these missions is in Washington and not in Taipei. Because Tsai Ing-wen knows what she's doing. She's not going to cross the red line. But it's not clear that American decision makers know what they're doing. And you could easily imagine them stepping way across Chinese red lines. So again, that's really what's been going on tactically in Taiwan. China's actually it's being careful, but it's trying to be as clear as it can in communicating to the United States that, leave it alone. Now, is this sustainable over the long run? Maybe not. Xi Jinping has said a few times that, the Taiwan problem is not one that can be postponed indefinitely, that, Chinese patience is not infinite. That's all pretty ominous. And I do worry that at some point China will decide, it's now or never and try to solve matters, take them into their own hands. I also agree emphatically, however, with Elizabeth, who presented in the first session, that China's rise is not continuing. China has probably, in significant respects, peaked, and that they may not have any opportunity in the future to be in a better position than they are now, which again could tempt them to try to solve the problem now rather than wait and hope that they'll be in a better position to solve it later. So next slide, that's pretty much what I have to say. Apart from, is there a grand underlying strategy here? I think so. And I think the grand underlying strategy is make sure international politics doesn't threaten the domestic rule of the Communist Party of China. It's all about keeping Xi Jinping in power. It's all about keeping the party in power. And if you sort of see that as the overarching governmental goal, it makes sense not only of Chinese foreign policy tactics, it also makes a lot of sense of Chinese domestic political behavior. And that, I think, is what it's all about. And is the Communist Party going to succeed in maintaining itself in power? That's going to be a very interesting question. If the economic growth fails, if COVID containment results in unrest, any number of things could actually cause civil unrest of the kind that could threaten the stability and legitimacy of the regime. But they just don't want international politics to serve as that kind of push, that kind of trigger. And that's, in my view, the best way to understand what they do tactically in these various flashpoints. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your presentation. And now we will have Dr. Lynette on with her presentation. Where does Canada fit in the US-China rivalry? Dr. Lynette Ong is an associate professor of political science, jointly appointed at the department and the Munk School of Global Affairs Asian Institute. Primarily a China expert, she has also published on Southeast Asia and India. Her research interests lie at the intersection of authoritarianism, contentious politics, and development. She has held the position of director of the Munk School China Initiative, the acting director of the Contemporary Asian Studies Program, and the director of the East Asia Seminar Series at the Asian Institute for many years. Dr. Lynette Ong, you now have the floor.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a great honor to be here. So I would like to speak about where does Canada fit into the US-China rivalry. So next slide, please. So we know that there's great power competition between US and China in many different aspects. We have heard today a lot about what it means in terms of military competition. China has increased its expenditures on military by many folds over the last 2 decades. The exact number is still a guess, but there's no doubt that militarily China is way more powerful now than it is a decade ago. And in many ways, it is in preparation for a war in Taiwan and with its aggressive stance in the South China Sea. But aside from military competition, there's also intense competition between the two powers in economic spheres. For a long time, China's comparative advantage is in low-cost labor, and that in a way complements the US comparative advantage very well, where the US has more human talent and more capital that is able to invest in China and make use of its low-cost capital. But since about 15 years ago, China's comparative advantage in low-cost labor is actually drying up. It has, in a way, in some ways, moved up the economic ladder. It has also been able to produce a lot more graduates that is doing technological innovation in some areas, not every areas, in some areas where it is able to copy Western technologies and improve its reach to market. So the last mile, the Chinese technological companies are able to do fairly well, even though they are not so capable in terms of basic research. So there's also increased economic competition, and with the current tension going on now between the two countries, the US has actually ordered a company like TSMC in Taiwan and various high-tech companies to not supply inputs that goes into high-tech manufacturing in China. So there's a great deal of tension in terms of economic cooperation that has been going on for a long time. There's also been technological competition. We in Canada are very familiar with the case of Huawei, and the Chinese would often say that the US has made so much fuss about Huawei is because in the United States they do not have a competitor. They don't have a competitive company in terms of 5G technology. So they are worried about China overtaking the United States. But I think, at the end of the day, it is really a competition about which political system is more superior, and whether or not this is a triumph of democracy versus autocracy, or democracy versus communism. I think in many ways, the debate at the root cause of it is about which political values and which political system actually ultimately prevails in producing a more powerful country. Next slide, please. Okay, China's foreign policy. So for a long time, the principle of China's foreign policy under Deng Xiaoping, and all the way until Jiang Zemin, and many would say even throughout, Hu Jintao's administration, has been one of hiding your strength and biding your time, meaning that you should not seek too much attention in the international stage because you're still a developing country. Should concentrate your resources into developing the economy. But I think since about 5-7 years ago, there has been a structural shift that China under Xi Jinping is out there to pursue a very ambitious China dream. And the underlying narrative of the China dream is one of national rejuvenation, as Tom Christensen has talked about, and really is about restoring China's rightful place in history. And I have italicized the word restore because this is not about China coming to the international stage for the first time. This is about restoring what it once occupied, right? And it also sees it as somehow a rightful occupation of a prominent position in the world stage. So in a way, there is a little bit of an entitlement attitude that China sees itself, that it was once upon a very strong and powerful country, the so-called Middle Kingdom, and now economically it is once again strong enough to pursue that sort of position. So in accordance with that, we have seen wolf warrior diplomacy, which is really not very diplomatic, the way that Chinese diplomats, foreign spokesperson from the foreign ministry, how they perform, how they interact with foreign government. There's nothing diplomatic about diplomacy. So that's sort of very brazen and aggressive and assertive type of positioning. Is, I think, a manifestation of years of humiliation right from the late Qing dynasty, and that is coming through. That sort of inferiority complex is then coming through. That is now manifested in the way that foreign diplomacy is carried out in China. The other major element within Chinese politics is the emergence of ultranationalism. Nationalism in the sense that I think the Chinese Communist Party has been playing up nationalism, using it as a tool to justify its many policies. It has been so successful to the extent that nationalism has become a double-edged sword. Double-edged sword in the sense that it has come back to bite the government. That the government hands are actually tied. The party's hands are tied if it doesn't appear to be strong enough in standing against foreign criticism, right? So in a way, it has become a victim of its own success, and we have seen this played out in many instances, such as its COVID policy, its relations with respect to Taiwan, with respect to South Korea, and with respect to Japan, and also with respect to Canada. That over on social media, many netizens have actually asked the government to be very strong vis-a-vis Canadian position. Next slide, please. So we have also heard a lot about the Belt and Road Initiative and how ambitious it is and its potential impact on Canada. On that front, I think China is actually not as strong as how people usually perceive. The Belt and Road Initiative is ambitious. A lot of money, financial resources has been put into it, but it's also a rather incoherent policy. On top of that, it is rather decentralized. Decentralized in the sense that there's kind of policy announcement at the central level, but implementation, actual programming is done at the decentralized level, and that includes provincial government as well as enterprise level, state-owned enterprises and various development banks within China that is disbursing financial assistance to companies investing abroad. So, and all these things are not necessarily centrally coordinated, right? It's a very fragmented type of approach. So what you have is multiple actors actually running the so-called Belt and Road Initiative projects. And they're all seen or projected by international media as representing China. But a Chinese company, how it behaves in Africa, right, versus how another state-owned enterprise behave in a project in Malaysia could tell you very different thing about China. But I think a lot of international perception tend to see Belt and Road Initiative, there's one unitary actor behind driving BRI. But in fact, I think that is actually quite far from the truth. If you were to peel behind that sort of multiplicity of actors, you see complexities behind how BRI actually works and how fragmented Chinese politics actually is. And BRI has also received a lot of pushback from host countries, from Southeast Asia, South Asia, Africa, Australia, and to some extent, Canada. Next slide, please. No, this is China under Xi Jinping. Okay. So China under Xi Jinping, Xi Jinping is really the emperor for life. Under Xi Jinping, there's a great deal of centralization of power, political power. The first thing when he got into his position was to launch this massive and very ambitious anti-corruption campaign. In rhetoric, this is about cleaning up the bureaucracy. But the subtle message is he is also out there to clean up any remaining opposition that might stand in the way of his plan to be emperor for life. So he has cleaned up a lot of factional infighting within his own party. There's also a great deal of economic centralization. There has been advancement of SOEs, state-owned enterprises, into private sphere. There has been a lot of establishment of Chinese Communist Party Paracel in private organizations and social organization. There has been increased state control over the economy, and more recently, reining in technology giants such as Alibaba, such as WeChat. If we think about what are the household Chinese brands that we are aware of? Jack Ma from Alibaba, Pony Ma from WeChat, from Weixin. And these, very successful Chinese companies have been actually reined in by the state, reined in by the CCP over the past year or so. Because I think for a long time, Chinese government sees value in what they do, including the ability to improve social control by carrying out censorship on behalf of the state and on behalf of the CCP. But I think the CCP has become so distrustful of the private sector that it is now trying to do almost everything in itself, and not trusting the partners in the society that it used to trust. So overall, there has been intensified repression across society through traditional means, but also through new technological means, particularly in the restive regions of Xinjiang and Hong Kong. I'm sure you have heard a lot about that, so I won't I won't elaborate further. Next slide, please. But what I do want to talk about is a little bit about the book, my book, which has just been released, which is going to be published next week. So this is this is a project that I started out back in 2011. You might be aware of, back in 2011, when I first started this project, China was in a very, very different place. The central argument that I'm making in this book is the way to think about how the CCP carry out repression is, yes, you have the coercive apparatus, you have the public security, you have the national security, but I would argue what makes China a really, really powerful state, what I call everyday state power, how it is actually manifested every day in Chinese society, is the way in which the Chinese Communist Party is able to outsource repression to two types of actors. Number one, violent agents, which is thugs and gangsters. And number two, non-violent agents. These are the grassroots brokers. So these violent agents are, like the book cover is portraying, these are anonymous people. It could be anyone from the Chinese street. You pull any person out. This person doesn't have a regular salary job, and he's willing to sell his muscle power for money. I've been told that this is usually costs about 100 yuan per day, and this sort of project will go on for a couple of months. So the empirical context that I study is housing demolition and land grabs in China, how the state regularly outsource coercion to thugs for hire. And this sort of thugs for hire is also quite different from gangsters and mafias, very well organized mafias that we know of in, let's say, Russia. Because when it becomes too powerful, then it would pose a challenge to state legitimacy. But the beauty of thugs for hire in China, I argue, is actually they are disorganized. They are actually loose individuals that they could actually be mobilized by the state to get the job done, state project done. However, they are actually not organized enough on their own that they would actually pose a threat to the state. And the other type of mobilized grassroots actors are residence committee, volunteers, which are totally independent of the state, but they feel that contributing to volunteering their time to the community is actually contributing to social goods. So even though I study housing demolition and I illustrate in the book how they work in terms of mobilization by the state and then trying to persuade people to sign on to papers to agree to demolition. In fact, we see how this is being carried out in lockdown, let's say in Shanghai. We think about how China is able to implement its zero COVID policy for the last couple of years so successfully until very recently, thanks to residence committee and thanks to the volunteers, right? And these are the people able to mobilize by the state to carry out state policies, from housing demolition to land grabs and now to zero COVID policy. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, so where does Canada fit into all this? I think, the US and China are locked in this very intense competition, but Canada is not actually directly in competition with China. Canada is, what we are in competition with is the political values and the political system in China that is fundamentally incompatible with the Western democracies, which Canada is part of. But in terms of technology competition and economic competition, which take up a lot of bandwidth in terms of the two great power competition, in some areas, Canada is actually more complementary with China. So I think in some areas there's still scope for cooperation between us and China in that respect. So to carry out the arguments to its logical conclusion, I would think the policy for Canada then is one about strategic alignment with the United States, that we have to align with the United States in areas that is actually compatible with our interests, right? But there is also about selected competition with China. Unlike the United States, we do not compete with China in every areas. However, it is also important, I think, to recognize that China today is fundamentally different from China, the way China was 5 or 10 years ago. And over the last 20 years, we see that how Canada's policy towards China has actually vacillated from one end to another, from very anti-China during Harper's years, even though in his later years he then changed his position, to very friendly towards China in early years of Justin Trudeau. I think either of the two polarized position is not actually helpful, because what China is has also changed. The nature of Chinese politics has actually changed over the last decade, particularly under Xi Jinping. And I think now, China's position, Canada's position with respect to China is really couched or framed overall within the Indo-Pacific strategy. And that is the position that the Biden administration is also taking. And my own reading is that, this is happening because of two reasons. Number one, neither the United States or Canada know how to deal with China directly. We just do not have the strength, or we just have no, smart policy yet to deal with China. And number two, this is China policy is framed within the Indo-Pacific strategy, is because Indo-Pacific is, such as the countries in the Quad Alliance, such as the ASEAN countries, are right in China's backyard. To deal with China effectively, we need to build long-lasting partnership and to build friendship with the Indo-Pacific countries. Is only, we shouldn't be using the word encircling, but it's only by making friends with people in China's backyard, then I think we could have a smart strategy about how to deal with China's rise more effectively. So I will leave it here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your presentation. And yes, thank you so much to both of you for being here and for giving us these presentations. And now we will have the question period. We already have a few questions, but the audience can feel free to type your questions in the chat, indicate an address to like one specific presenter or everyone. And so I think the first question is one for Dr. David Welch. Since you are also a Japan expert, what is Japan's role in managing this relationship? And is that where Canada can fit in, helping Japan navigate all of this, or copying Japan's strategy?
Thanks. Well, first, I don't describe myself as a Japan expert. I'm very careful not to do that. But I like to think of myself as a security expert, security person. In any case, that said, Japan has clearly thrown in its lot with the United States unambiguously. I think that is a positive thing. That's exactly where Japan should be. I think the US-Japan security relationship has been sort of the cornerstone of peace and security in East Asia since the very beginning. And Canada, of course, is not a member of the US-Japan alliance, but Canada can signal its support symbolically. It can contribute in a helpful way. For example, as it's been doing now through Operation Neon, sending military assets to help contain North Korea, enforce sanctions against North Korea. As long as Canada is sort of in step with the United States and Japan in its signaling, I think that's the most effective kind of contribution we can make. Japan will let the Americans take the lead, but they're very unambiguously signaling to China that Taiwan in particular, a Taiwan contingency would be a Japan contingency. And that's becoming a bit of a mantra. And I think the Chinese now clearly understand that if they take military action against Taiwan, they're probably also going to be involved in military action with the United States and Japan, at least in some level and in some form. And again, that can only help boost deterrence.
Thank you so much for your answer. And we have another question for Dr. Lynette Ong. What possible strategies can Canada employ to respond to China's will for diplomacy, especially online?
If you want my honest opinion, I would think, we should just ignore it. The reason is, I think, if we understand why they behave the way they do, I think it fundamentally stems from a sense of inferiority and feeling inadequate that they have actually arrived. So they are learning how to behave diplomatically. I think the way to deal with this sort of behavior is just to ignore it, because by engaging with that sort of behavior, by being aggressive with them, we are just going to provoke further behavior, and it's just going to breed a vicious cycle. So be mature and be smart about it if we want to really respond very selectively, and one shouldn't get too emotional about it.
Thank you very much. And I also have a question for you myself, Dr. Lynette. So you mentioned that like in the last few years, Xi Jinping has, cracked down on the private sector, him and the CCP. Why exactly is that, do you think?
There are a number of reasons. Number one, some would say Xi Jinping is just being Xi Jinping, that he's a really ambitious individual. He is son of a princeling. His father was a high-level CCP official who has served alongside Mao and fought in the revolution. His formative years were spent during the Cultural Revolution in the countryside. His whole formative experience has been about communism, right? So he's a communist fellow, and very much produced by the system and is still part of the system. So this is a very personality driven explanation. But the more institutional or structural reason is, if you look at the shape of Chinese economy, the way that it is now, even though I would agree that it has actually peaked, but the shape of Chinese economy is in much better shape compared to a decade or 3-4 decades ago. So in a way, I think the economy, size of the economy, scale of the economy, and its might has afforded its leader the confidence to pursue political objectives, things that they feel that has really reasonably belonged to them, that was taken away from them since the late Qing dynasty, since the beginning of 1900s. National humiliation, they have to cede Hong Kong to the British, have to carve out Macau to the Portuguese, and those are very humiliating experience as far as the PRC is concerned. And now they have reached a stage where they can claim back what they have lost.
Thank you very much for your answer. Also, I think we have a question for both of you, and I think you can both answer it if you wish. We know that Canada needs to secure more bilateral trade agreements with more countries in order to compete with the United States. How do we get our national defense policies to reflect this economic need for Canadian GDP?
I think this should be a question for Professor Welch.
Well, it's an intriguing question. I would say at the grand level, the Canadian and American economies are symbiotic, so they aren't really competing economies. There's competition in specific sectors and between specific firms, but the grand scheme of things, the Canadian economy does well when the American economy does well, and so on. Trade agreements, of course, promote predictability, stability, enhance trade flows, and these can generate wealth. So trade agreements usually very good things. Whether they're bilateral, multilateral, it doesn't necessarily matter. And Canada has both, has had both bilateral and multilateral trade agreements. Specifically with respect to this part of the world, the CPTPP is a multilateral agreement. Canada got pretty good deal and managed to make sure the negotiations reflected Canadian interests pretty well. I don't think our defense policy bears terribly on the likelihood of conducting trade deals, but the more countries of the region appreciate our contribution in security matters, the less they'll see us as basically mercenary and only looking for economic benefits to engagement. And that's where Canada has fallen down in the last 20 years, as we more or less disappeared from the security tables in the region. And we were all just talking trade all the time, and it frankly annoyed countries of the region who really felt that Canada should be a full partner if it was to get any kind of concessionary treatment at all on anything. So I think we finally realized that. We're trying to get back in. We're trying to make more of a constructive security commitment. On multilateral and bilateral trade deals, I think Canada should go ahead and cut a deal with Taiwan, basically for a bilateral trade arrangement that is exactly on the terms of the CPTPP. And so in effect, you would have concurrent Taiwanese accession to the CPTPP through legislation rather than necessarily as a treaty partner. Of course, if Taiwan signed on as a full treaty partner to the CPTPP, then China would go crazy. But China has no realistic objection to concurrent legislation establishing terms of trade on CPTPP terms with Taiwan. So Canada should go ahead and do that, and show the rest of the partnership how to do that. And I think Japan would do the same very quickly, and maybe everyone else would follow suit too. That would be also a contribution to, international support for Taiwan's autonomy. So that's one thing I would encourage us to think about seriously.
Thank you very much for your answer. And again, thank you both so much for being here. And it's great to see your expertise, but also you interacting with the other presenters that went previously. So I think we will, panel 2 will come to a close, and we will be going for a break and coming back at 3:30 for panel 3. And again, thank you so much, Dr. David Welch and Dr. Lynette Ong, for being here. It means so much, and we really appreciate your expertise.
You're welcome.
Thank you.